Welcome to Soft Mystic Stories. Here's something impossible. The Samians told a story about great flood. A man named Utnapishtim built a boat, saved his family, saved the animals. The waters rose, the world drowned. Only those on the boat survived. The Hebrews told the same story, different name, Noah instead of Utnapishtim. Same boat, same animals, same flood, same survival. The Greeks had their version, Deucalion and Pyrrha, a flood sent by Zeus. Everyone drowned except 2 people on a boat. In India, Manu received a warning from a fish. Build a boat. A flood is coming. He built it. The waters rose. Only Manu survived. The Chinese have the story of Gunu, massive floods. The world underwater. Civilization nearly destroyed. Native American tribes across both continents tell flood stories. The Ojibwe, the Hopi, the Inca. Different details, same core event. Aboriginal Australians remember a great rising of waters. Pacific Islanders have flood myths on islands separated by thousands of miles of ocean. Over 200 cultures have flood myths. That's not an exaggeration. Researchers have counted them. Over 200 distinct civilizations. Many had no contact with each other. They couldn't have shared the story. Yet they all remember the same thing. A flood, massive enough to destroy the world. Recent enough to remember, specific enough to pass down through generations. Here's what makes this strange. These aren't vague disaster stories. They're specific. The water rose. It covered everything. Almost everyone died. A few people survived, usually on a boat. Then the waters receded. Humanity started over. The details match too closely to ignore. But they're different enough that these aren't just one story spreading around the world. These are independent memories of the same event. Think about what that means. For all these cultures to remember a flood, something had to happen. Something big enough that people told their children. Who told their children? Who told their children? For thousands of years, stories don't survive that long unless they matter. Unless they're true. Unless they're so important that forgetting them feels dangerous. But here's the problem. Geologically, there's no evidence of a single global flood that covered the entire Earth. At least not in human history, not in the last 200,000 years. So what are they remembering? Some scientists say it's simple. Humans live near water, rivers, coasts. When you live near water, you experience floods. Every culture would have flood stories because every culture experienced floods. But that doesn't explain the specificity. Local floods don't destroy the whole world. They don't require boats for survival. They don't make people feel like humanity almost ended. These stories feel bigger than that. Other researchers point to the end of the Ice Age. Around 11,000 years ago, the ice melted. Sea levels rose about 400 feet. Coastlines moved inland. Islands vanished. Low-lying areas flooded. That's massive. That's world-changing. That's the kind of thing people would remember. But 11,000 years is a long time. Can stories really survive that long? Maybe if they mattered enough, or maybe something else happened, something more recent, more devastating, something we haven't found evidence for yet. The mystery isn't just that these stories exist, it's that they exist everywhere independently, with the same core details. What did our ancestors see? What did they survive? And why does every civilization on Earth remember it? The planet was frozen, not metaphorically, actually frozen. Ice covered a third of Earth's land surface. Glaciers 2 m thick sat on top of what's now New York City. Chicago was under ice. So was London, Berlin, Moscow. This wasn't ancient history. This was 20,000 years ago. Humans were alive, walking around, hunting, making tools, telling stories by fires. The world they knew was ice. And then it ended. Around 11,600 years ago, something shifted. The temperature rose fast, faster than it should have. The ice started melting. Think about what that means. Miles of ice turning to water. Where does that water go? Into the ocean. Sea levels rose about 400 feet. That's the height of a 40-story building. Imagine standing at sea level. Now imagine the water rising 400 feet above your head. Coastlines moved inland, miles inland, islands vanished, river valleys flooded, land bridges disappeared under waves. This happened over thousands of years, but in geological terms, that's fast. In human terms, it was slow enough to notice. Generation by generation, the water kept rising. Your grandfather remembered when the shore was over there. Your father remembered when it was closer. Now it's at your doorstep. The Black Sea is a good example. We'll get to the details later. But here's the basic story. It used to be a freshwater lake, smaller than it is now, lower than sea level, protected by a natural dam of land. Then the Mediterranean broke through. Salt water poured in. The lake became a sea. The shoreline moved miles inland, vast enough that people had to run. That happened around 5,600 BCE. Recent enough that people remembered, recent enough to become a story. But the Black Sea wasn't alone. This was happening everywhere. The Persian Gulf used to be dry land, a river valley. People lived there. Archaeologists have found evidence. Then the sea rose. The valley flooded. The Gulf formed. The English Channel didn't exist. Britain was connected to Europe. You could walk from London to Paris. Then the ice melted. The water rose. The connection flooded. Britain became an island. Dogland was a large area of land connecting Britain to mainland Europe. Hills, river. People lived there. We found their tools underwater. Their hunting grounds, their homes, then the sea took it. All of it gone under waves. In Southeast Asia, the Sun Shelf was exposed. A massive area of land bigger than India connected Indonesia to mainland Asia. People lived there, migrated across it, built communities. The sea rose, the land flooded. What's now thousands of islands used to be one connected region. The same thing happened in the Americas along every coast. The Pacific Northwest, the Atlantic seaboard, the Gulf of Mexico, the Caribbean islands, everywhere humans lived near water. The water came closer. Some areas flooded gradually, inch by inch, year by year, slow enough that people adapted, moved inland, rebuilt. Other areas flooded catastrophically. A storm surge during a period of rising seas, a natural dam breaking, a tsunami triggered by underwater landslides as the continental shelves adjusted to the weight of new water. The Sterriga slide happened around 6,100 BCE off the coast of Norway. A massive underwater landslide triggered a tsunami. Waves hit Scotland, reached 80 feet high in some places, wiped out coastal settlements. People survived, but they remembered. Here's what matters. These weren't isolated events. This was global. Every coastline, every river valley near the sea, every low-lying area. And it happened when humans were around to see it, to experience it, to run from it, to tell stories about it. The timing is important. Modern humans appeared 300,000 years ago, but for most of that time, we lived in small groups, scattered, mobile. We didn't build permanent settlements. We moved with the seasons, followed the herds. Around 12,000 years ago, that changed. We started settling down, building villages, farming, staying in one place, right when the ice was melting, right when the seas were rising. So the first permanent hum and settlements were built during a period of massive flooding. The first cities rose as the waters rose. Every early civilization lived near water, rivers, coasts. That's where farming worked. That's where trade happened. That's where people gathered, and all of them experienced the water rising. The Sumerians in Mesopotamia, the Egyptians along the Nile, the Indus Valley civilization, the Yellow River culture in China, the early settlements in the Americas, all of them, all near water, all during this period. Now think about oral tradition. How stories pass down. You tell your children what you saw, what you survived, what mattered. They tell their children who tell their children. Important stories survive. Dangerous knowledge survives. This river floods. This plant is poison. This is how we survived the time the water came. A flood big enough to destroy your village, big enough to kill your neighbors, big enough to kill your neighbors, big enough to force your people to move. That's a story you tell. And if it keeps happening, if every generation experiences some version of it, if the water keeps rising for thousands of years, the story gets reinforced, embedded, made sacred. This is what our ancestors survived. This is what we must remember. This is what could happen again. The flood myths aren't remembering one event. They're remembering a period, an era, thousands of years when the world was changing, when the waters kept rising, when humanity had to adapt or die. Different cultures experienced different floods, different catastrophes, but the pattern was the same. Water rising, land disappearing, people fleeing, starting over. Some floods were gradual, some were sudden, some were local tsunamis, some were river valleys filling, some were coastlines moving, but they all happened. They were all real, and they all got remembered. The details changed as the stories passed down. Names changed, gods got added, moral lessons got attached. The boat became an ark. The survivor became a hero, the flood became divine punishment. But the core remained. Water rose. The world changed. We barely survived. That's not myth. That's memory. Geologists can track it. The ice cores show the warming. The sea level data shows the rise. The underwater archaeology shows the flooded settlements. It happened globally over thousands of years, right when humans were building the first civilizations. Every culture near water experienced some version of it. Every culture remembered. Every culture passed it down. The mystery isn't why flood myths exist. The mystery is why we ever doubted they were based on real events. The Ice Age ended. The water rose. Humanity survived barely, and we've been telling that story ever since. Now let's look at one specific example, one flood that might explain one very famous story. A flood that happened recently enough that we can pinpoint when dramatically enough that people ran for their lives, and significant enough that it changed human history. The Black Sea flood and the story of Noah. If you're using this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you're watching from and what time it is. It's strange when you think about it. We're separated by oceans and time zones, but we're all here listening to the same stories, wondering about the same questions. What did our ancestors survive? What did they remember? What truths hide inside their myths? There's something comforting in that. We're not so different from them or from each other. Anyway, back to the floods. The Black Sea sits between Europe and Asia. Dark water, deep water, about 168,000 square miles of it. Today, it's a sea connected to the Mediterranean through a narrow strait, the Bozarus, a channel of water running through what's now Istanbul. But it wasn't always this way. Around 7,000 years ago, the Black Sea was a lake, fresh water, smaller than it is now. The surface sat about 500 feet lower than today. The shoreline was miles further out where there's water now. There was land, beaches, river valleys, places where people lived. We know people lived there because we found their settlements, underwater preserved beneath the waves. In 1999, Robert Ballard led an expedition. Yes, that Robert Ballard, the guy who found the Titanic. His team used sonar to map the Black Sea floor. They found something strange, an ancient coastline, underwater about 300 feet down. They found river channels carved into the seabed, following paths that made sense when the water was lower. They found structures, rectangular shapes, too regular to be natural, buildings or what's left of them. They brought up samples, wood preserved in the oxygen-free depths. Carbon dating put the wood around 5,500 BCE before the flood. Here's what the evidence suggests happened. The Black Sea was a lake fed by rivers, the Danube, the Dane, the Don, fresh water flowing in. But the lake had no outlet. It sat in a basin, surrounded by land, protected from the Mediterranean by a ridge of rock and soil, a natural dam where the Bosphorus is now. Then the ice melted. Global sea levels climbed. The Mediterranean filled up higher and higher till it reached the level of that natural dam, and then it broke through. Not slowly, not gradually. The Mediterranean punched through the barrier. Salt water poured into the freshwater lake fast. Really fast. Geologists William Ryan and Walter Pittman studied this in the 1990s. They calculated the flow rate about 200 times the volume of Niagara Falls every day for months, maybe years. The lake surface climbed about 6 in per day. That doesn't sound like much, 6 in. But think about what that means over time. In a week, the Shu, Rilin, moves inland by yards. In a month, by hundreds of yards. In a year, by miles. If you lived on the shore, you'd notice. Your beach disappears. Your fishing spots go underwater. Your village floods. You move inland. Build again. The water keeps coming. You move again and again. Eventually, you give up. You leave. You go somewhere the water can't reach. The lake became a sea. The shoreline moved about 100 miles inland in some places. Thousands of square miles of land went underwater. River valleys became bays. Hills became islands. An entire landscape drowned. This happened fast enough that people remembered, slow enough that they could escape. Nobody died in a sudden wave, but everyone lost their homes, their land, their world. The evidence keeps piling up. In 2000, Ballard's team found more structures clearly human-made. Stone tools, pottery fragments, signs of agriculture, all underwater, all from before the flood. In 2003, they found preserved wooden beams, carved, shaped part of a building, carbon dated to 5600 BCE, right when the flood happened. The sediment layers tell the story too. Cores drilled from the seafloor show a clear change. Below a certain depth, freshwater deposits, shells from freshwater deposits, shells from freshwater deposits, marine organisms. The transition is sharp, sudden, not gradual. The shells themselves are interesting. Freshwater mussels don't survive in salt water. When the Mediterranean broke through, they died. All of them. At once, their shells settled to the bottom, a layer of death marking the exact moment the lake became a sea. There's a hydrogen sulfide layer, too. The Black Sea is weird. Below about 200 m, there's almost no oxygen, just hydrogen sulfide. Poisonous. Nothing lives down there except certain bacteria. This happened because of the flood. When the salt water poured in, it was denser than the fresh water. Tea sank to the bottom, created a layer. The two types of water don't mix well. The bottom layer became stagnant, oxygen-free, perfect for preserving things, like ancient settlements. Scientists have debated the speed. Some think it happened over decades. Others say centuries. But even if it took 100 years, that's fast. Fast enough for stories. Fast enough for trauma. Fast enough to remember. Think about the people who lived there. They had villages, farms, trade routes, culture. Then the water came, not all at once, but relentlessly. You couldn't fight it. You couldn't stop it. All you could do was leave. Take what you could carry. Walk away from everything else. Your home, your fields, your ancestors' graves, all underwater. Now, where did they go? Inland, up into the hills, into what's now Bulgaria, Romania, Ukraine, Turkey. They spread out, carried their stories with them, told their children about the land that drowned, the sea that swallowed their world. And here's where it gets interesting. The timing matches. The Black Sea flood happened around 5600 BCE. That's right when agriculture started spreading rapidly through Europe. Before this, farming was mostly in the Middle East. After this, it exploded north and west, into the Balkans, up the Danube, across the continent. Maybe that's a coincidence, or maybe it's not. Maybe the flood displaced thousands of farmers, forced them to migrate. They brought their seeds, their animals, their knowledge. They taught the hunter-gatherers they met. Farming spread because refugees spread, running from water. The Sumerians lived in Mesopotamia, about 1,000 miles from the Black Sea, but trade routes connected them. Stories travel along trade routes. A Sumerian merchant hears about a great flood from a northern trader. He tells someone else, the story spreads, gets written down, becomes the Epic of Gilgamesh, becomes the story of Utnapi, Shim, the man who survived the flood by building a boat. The Hebrews were in contact with Mesopotamian culture. They knew Sumerian stories. They adapted them. Noah's flood might be a memory of the Black Sea, filtered through centuries, changed by retelling, but still recognizable, still about water rising, land drowning, starting over. Is this the flood? The one flood that explains all the myths? Maybe the timing works, the scale works, the details work. A real event dramatic enough to remember, recent enough to pass down, specific enough to survive a story. But here's the thing, the Black Sea flood explains the Middle Eastern and European myths pretty well. It doesn't explain the others, the Chinese flood myths, the Indian stories, the Native American tales, Australia, the Pacific Islands. They're too far away, too disconnected. They couldn't have heard about the Black Sea, which means either there were multiple floods worth remembering, or there was something even bigger, something global, something that affected coastlines everywhere at roughly the same time. The Ice Age ended. Sea levels climbed everywhere. The Black Sea was just one example, one dramatic, sudden, memorable example. But coastlines drowned on every continent. Islands vanished in the Pacific. River valleys flooded in China. The Persian Gulf filled up. The English Channel formed. Dog land disappeared. Maybe that's what people remember. Not one flood, many floods, all caused by the same thing. The ice melting, the ocean rising, the world changing. Each culture remembers their local version, their particular disaster. But they all happened around the same time, all for the same reason. The Black Sea is proof it happened. Proof that floods were real, dramatic, memorable, dramatic enough to become myth. But it's not the only proof. It's just the clearest example. The one we can measure, date, map, nay, where the evidence survived underwater, waiting for us to find it. Between Britain and mainland Europe, there's water. The North Sea, cold grey. About 220,000 square miles of it. Ships cross it. Oil rigs dot the surface. Fishing boats work the depths. But 20,000 years ago, you could walk from London to Amsterdam. No boat needed, no water in the way, just land, hills, rivers, forests, a whole country that doesn't exist anymore. We call it Dogger Land. The name comes from Dogger Bank, a shallow area in the North Sea where fishing boats used to snag their nets on something. Turned out that something was ancient, drowned land, the remnants of a lost world. Fishermen started pulling up strange things in their nets. Bones, huge bonds, mammoth bones, tools made from stone and antler, pieces of peat, trees, all from the sea floor from depths of 60 to 120 feet down. In 1931, a fishing boat called the Kinder was working near Dogger Bank. The nets came up with a lump of peat. The crew almost tossed it back, but someone looked closer. There was something stuck in it, a barbed point made from deer antler carved, shaped by human hands, about 13,000 years old. People made that tool on dry land. Then the land went underwater. Scientists got interested. They started mapping the seafloor using sonar, seismic surveys, the kind of technology oil companies use to find drilling sites. What they found was incredible. An entire landscape preserved beneath the waves. There were river valleys. You could trace them for miles. See where they twisted and turned, where tributaries joined, where they carved through hills. These weren't underwater currents. These were real rivers flowing across land before the sea covered them. There were lakes, shallow depressions in the seafloor. You could see the shorelines, the places where beaches used to be. Some were miles across. There were hills rising fra, on the surrounding flatness. Islands now if the water level dropped, but back then they were just high ground. Good places to camp, good views for hunting. The land connected Britain to Europe, but it wasn't just a bridge. It was a place, a real place where people lived, probably for thousands of years. Dogger land was huge. At its largest, it covered about 100,000 square miles, bigger than Britain. It stretched from what's now Scotland down to the Netherlands, east to Denmark, west to the English coast. Right in the middle sat a massive river, fed by the Thames, the Rhine, the Seine, all flowing into one giant waterway, draining north into the Arctic Ocean. The climate was different then, colder but not frozen. Tundra in the north, grasslands in the south, forests along the rivers, good hunting, deer aurochs, wild horses, mammoths in the early days, fish in the rivers, birds in the marshes, everything you needed to survive. People lived there. We know because we keep finding their stuff. Stone tools turn up regularly. Axes, scrapers, blades, all from the seafloor. All made by humans. All proof the Dogland wasn't empty. In 2019, archaeologists found something amazing. A site off the coast of Norrock underwater about 30 feet down. They found worked flints, hammerstones, a core where someone had been knapping tools, making blades. The site was 11,500 years old, right at the end of the Ice Age. But here's what made it special. The tools were still there in place where someone had been working. They'd been sitting there for 11,500 years. Then the sea came, covered them, preserved them, protected them from erosion and decay. That's rare. Usually the sea destroys things, waves batter, currents scatter, but Dogland's drowning was gentle. The water rose slowly, covered things without smashing them, buried them in sediment, kept them safe. We'll probably never find settlements, Draughts, even underwater. Leather disappears, fabric's gone. What survives is stone, bone, antler, the hard stuff, the durable stuff. But it's enough to know people were there. How many people, hard to say. Hunter-gatherers move around. They don't build permanent villages. Not usually. They follow the herds, follow the seasons. But Dogland was rich. Lots of resources. Rivers for fish, forests for game, coastline for shellfish. You could support a decent population, maybe thousands of people, maybe more. They probably didn't think of it as one place. They had territories, hunting grounds, sacred sites, places they returned to. But it was all connected, all part of the same landscape, the same world. And then it started drowning. The ice melted. We covered that earlier. Global sea levels climbed. But Dogland didn't flood all at once. It happened in stages over thousands of years. Slow enough that people adapted, fast enough that they noticed. First the low areas went underwater. River valleys filled up, became estuaries, then bays, marshland, spread. What used to be solid ground turned boggy, wet, hard to cross. The coastline moved inland, year by year, generation by generation. The big river in the middle became an estuary. Salt water pushed upstream. The fishing changed. Freshwater fish disappeared. Saltwater species moved in. People adjusted, changed their tools, changed their techniques, kept fishing. The hills became islands, isolated, cut off from the mainland. Maybe people still lived there for a while. Boats could reach them. But eventually the islands got too small, too exposed, too far from resources. People left. Around 8,200 years ago, something dramatic happened. A massive underwater landslide off the coast of Norway. The Stoga Slide. Huge amounts of sediment collapsed, slid down the continental shelf, triggered a tsunami, a big one, maybe 80 feet high. In some places, the wave hit Dogger Land, what was left of it. By then, most of the land was already underwater. Just a few islands remained. The tsunami finished the job, swept over the islands, destroyed whatever was there. When the water receded, there was less land than before, just a few tiny rocks. Then those went under too. By 6,500 years ago, Doggerland was gone, completely submerged. Britain became an island. Europe was separate. The North Sea covered everything. But people remembered. They must have. The stories would have been incredible. Your great-great-grandfather lived on land that's now underwater, walked where ships sail, hunted where fish swim. The old people remembered when you could walk to the continent, when there was no sea in the way, just land. Solid ground, a whole country that drowned. Did those memories become myths? Maybe Britain has flood legends. So does Northern Europe, stories about lands that sank beneath the waves, cities that drowned, people who had to flee rising water. Are those memories of Doggerland distorted by time, changed by retelling but still carrying some truth, some echo of what really happened? We'll never know for sure. The stories are too old, too changed, but the possibility's there. Real floods, real drowned lands, real people who survived. Their descendants told stories. Those stories spread, changed, became legends, became myths, but started with truth. Doggin proves floods happened. Real ones big enough to drown entire countries, recent enough that humans were there, witnessed it, survived it, remembered it. And Dogland wasn't unique. This was happening everywhere. Every coastline, every continent. The ice melted, the seas rose, land went underwater. People had to move, had to adapt, had to remember. The Persian Gulf used to be a river valley. The Red Sea was narrower. The Mediterranean coastline was miles further out. Indonesia was connected to mainland Asia. Australia and New Guinea were one land mass. The Bering Strait was dry land. You could walk from Asia to America, all of that drowned, all of it within human memory. All of that drowned, all of it within human memory, within the time frame where stories could survive, where oral traditions could preserve, the knowledge where people could say, my ancestors lived there, where the water is now, before the flood came. Every coastal culture would have flood stories. Because every coast flooded, the details would differ, the scale would vary, but the core memory would be the same. The water rose, the land drowned. We survived, we moved, we started over. Dogland is just the example we can measure. Map study because it's recent enough, shallow enough, accessible enough, accessible enough. The evidence survived, but it represents something bigger, something global. The end of the Ice Age, the rising of the seas, the drowning of the old world, the beginning of the new one. The world our ancestors knew disappeared beneath the waves. They watched it happen generation by generation, and they remembered. They told their children, who told their children, who told theirs. The stories changed, got bigger, got stranger, mixed with other stories, other floods, other disasters. But somewhere in there, buried beneath layers of myth and legend and time, there's truth, there's memory, there's Doggerland, and all the other drowned lands, all the other lost worlds, all the other floods that really happened. The Mediterranean holds secrets beneath the waves. Cities that shouldn't exist, structures too old to explain, places where people lived before the water came. Off the coast of India near Gujarat, there's something strange. About 120 feet underwater to Gulf of Cat. In 2001, marine archaeologists were doing routine surveys, mapping the seafloor, looking for shipwrecks. They found something else. Sonar showed geometric patterns, regular shapes too regular to be natural, long straight lines, right angles, structures. They sent down cameras. The images were murky, sediment clouds, everything at that depth, but you could see it. Stone blocks arranged in patterns, walls, maybe foundations. They brought up samples, pieces of wood, pottery shards, fossilized bone. Carbon dating gave wild numbers. Some samples tested at 9,500 years old. That's older than the pyramids, older than Stonehenge, older than most civilizations we know about. The discoveries sparked debate. Some archaeologists got excited. Others stayed skeptical. The site is controversial. The water's too murky. The evidence too fragmentary, but something's down there. Whether it's a city or just natural formations, we're not sure yet. But it's there underwater. Old, strange. Japan has its own mystery. Off the coast of Yunnan Island, about 80 feet down. A diver found it in 1986. He was looking for hammerhead sharks. Found stone terraces. Instead, the Yunnan Monument. That's what they call it. Massive stone structures, stepped platforms, flat terraces, sharp edges, right angles, parallel grooves carved into the rock. It looks artificial, like someone built it, shaped it, used it. The main structure is huge, about 165 feet long, 65 feet wide, rising 80 feet from the seafloor. There are steps, wide ones, leading up the terraces. There are channels, carved pathways, a stone pillar standing upright, holes drilled into rock faces. Some geologists say it's natural. Sandstone forms in layers. Erosion can create flat surfaces, straight edges. The whole thing could be a quirk of geology, water, and time doing what they do. But other experts aren't convinced. The right angles are too precise, the steps too regular, the channels too straight. Nature doesn't usually work that way, not this cleanly, not this symmetrically. If it's artificial, it's old, really old. The structure would have been above water during the last ice age, when sea levels were lower. That puts it at least 10,000 years old, maybe older, before any civilization we know about, before agriculture, before cities, before writing. Who would have built it? Hunter-gatherers. We don't think they built monuments. Not usually. But maybe we're wrong. Maybe some groups did. Maybe they had reasons we don't understand. Religious sites, ceremonial platforms, meeting places. We don't know. The site sits there waiting. Divers visit it, film it, measure it, debate about it. The ocean keeps its secrets. The sediment hides details. The depth makes excavation difficult. So, it remains mysterious, possibly natural, possibly ancient, definitely strange. Cuba has reports too. In 2001, a marine engineering company was mapping the seafloor off the western coast using sonar. They found structures about 2,000 feet down. That's deep, really deep, too deep for normal diving. The sonar showed geometric patterns, pyramid shapes, rectangular structures, something that looked like roads, all arranged in what seemed like a city layout. They sent down a robot, submarine, got video footage, grainy dark, but you could see shapes, blocks, formations, things that looked built. The depth is the problem. At 2,000 feet, that site would have been underwater for an incredibly long time, since before the last ice age, before humans were supposed to be in the Americas. The timeline doesn't work, unless our timeline is wrong. The Cuban government got interested, then quiet. The site hasn't been explored much since. Too deep, too expensive, too controversial. But the sonar images exist. Something's down there, whether it's ancient ruins or underwater geology. Nobody's proven it either way. The Mediterranean keeps giving up secrets near Alexandria, Egypt, Heraclean, and Canopus. Two City is lost for over 1,000 years. People knew they existed. Ancient texts mentioned them. Greek historians wrote about them. But nobody knew where they were. Then divers found them underwater, about 20 feet down in Abukia Bay. Heraclean was a major port before Alexandria rose to prominence. Ships from Greece stopped there. Trade goods flowed through. Temples stood along the waterfront. A huge statue of a pharaoh guarded the harbor. Then the city sank slowly over centuries. Earthquakes, soil liquefaction. The ground just gave way. Buildings tilted. Walls crumbled. The sea moved in. Divers have recovered incredible things. Statues, huge ones, stone blocks with hieroglyphs, gold coins, jewelry, ships, actual ancient ships preserved in the sediment. The city's still there, mostly intact, just underwater, waiting. Petri sits off the coast of southern Greece. Another drowned city. This one's older, about 5,000 years old. Bronze Age, the oldest submerged city we've found so far. It's shallow, only 10 to 13 feet down. You can see it from the surface on calm days. The layout's preserved: streets, buildings, courtyards, tombs. You can map the city, see how it was organized, where people lived, where they worked, where they buried their dead. It sank gradually. Earthquakes, probably. The land subsided. The sea crept in. People abandoned it, left everything behind. These aren't myths. These are real cities, real places where real people lived. And they're all underwater now, drowned, preserved. Proof that floods happened, that coastlines changed, that the world our ancestors knew disappeared beneath the waves. But here's what's interesting: these cities sank recently. Historia stops. Historically speaking, Heraclean went under about 1,200 years ago. Pavlo-Petri maybe 3,000 years ago. We have records of them. We know they existed. We know they sank. Now, think about the older sites, the Controve, raise your ones, Yononi, Gulf of Cat, the Cuban formations. If those are real, if they're actually ancient cities, they'd be from before recorded history, before writing, before we have clear records of anything. They'd be from the time when sea levels were rising, when coastlines were flooding, when the Ice Age was ending, if cities existed then. They're underwater now, all of them. Every coastal settlement from that era gone, drowned, buried under sediment, hidden beneath hundreds of feet of water. We'd never find them, not without incredible luck, not without knowing exactly where to look. How many cities are down there? How many settlements? How many places where people lived, worked, raised families, told stories? Hundreds, thousands, all lost, all forgotten, except maybe in stories, in myths, in flood legends passed down through generations. The ocean covers 71% of Earth's surface. Most of it's never been explored. Not really. We've mapped it with sonar, but that's different from actually looking, actually searching, actually excavating. The depths hide everything. Sediment buries things. Currents scatter evidence. Time erodes details. We found a handful of underwater sites by accident. Mostly fishermen snagging nets, divers exploring sonar surveys, looking for something else. But we're not systematically searching. We don't have the resources. The technology is expensive. The ocean's huge. The depths are challenging. What we've found is probably a tiny fraction of what's there. The obvious stuff, the shallow sites, the lucky discoveries. But deeper down, further out, in places nobody's looked, there could be anything. Entire cities, whole civilizations, lost worlds we don't even know existed. And the deeper you go, the older things get, because sea levels rose. The shoreline moved inland. What's 300 feet down now was coastline 15,000 years ago. What's 400 feet down was coast 20,000 years ago. Every coastal city from that era is underwater. Every port, every fishing village, every settlement built near the sea, all drowned, all hidden, all waiting. This changes how we think about flood myths. They're not just memories of rising seas. They're memories of lost places, actual cities, actual homes, actual lives. Your ancestors lived there, where the water is now, before it went under, before the flood came, before everything changed. The stories say the world flooded, that cities drowned, that people had to flee, that cities drowned, that people had to flee, that civilization nearly ended. And they're right. It did happen. We have proof underwater. Scattered across every ocean in depth we're only beginning to explore. The evidence is there, submerged, preserved, waiting for us to find it. So why does everyone remember a flood? That's the real question, not whether floods happened. We know they did. Sea levels rose 400 feet. Coastlines moved inland. Cities drowned. That's proven. The question is why the memory survived. Why it became myth. Why cultures separated by oceans tell the same story. Most history gets forgotten. Villages burn. Battles happen. Kingdoms fall. A generation passes. Then another. Details blur. Names fade. Events merge together. Within a few hundred years, specifics disappear. What remains are fragments, vague impressions, stories that might be true but probably aren't. Yet flood myths persist, crystal clear, passed down for thousands of years, across hundreds of cultures, with details intact. The water rose, everything drowned, a few survived. Humanity started over. That's specific, that's detailed, that's remembered. There's a theory, several actually, about how collective memory works, about what kinds of events stick in cultural consciousness, about why some stories survive when most don't. Trauma creates memory, not pleasant experiences, not normal days. Trauma, things that hurt, the things that threaten survival, those get remembered, those get passed down. Because forgetting them could be fatal. Your ancestors lived through something terrible. A flood, maybe an earthquake, a volcanic eruption. Whatever it was, it killed people. Lots of people. Changed everything. The survivors told their children, warned them, explained what happened, why they had to leave their homes, why half the family was gone, why the world looked different now. Those children told their children. The story changed slightly. Details shifted, but the core remained. Something bad happened. Water rose. People died. We survived. Remember this. Generation after generation, the story evolved, became more dramatic, more mythological. Gods got involved. Explanations emerged, reasons why it happened, lessons about what it meant. But underneath all that, the memory stayed, the flood, the destruction, the survival. Psychologists call this cultural trauma. Events so devastating they mark an entire society. They become part of group identity, part of how that culture understands itself. We are the people who survived the flood. That's who we are. That's our story. The Holocaust gets remembered, not because it happened recently, but because it was traumatic, devastating, world-changing. Survivors told their stories, made sure people knew, made sure nobody forgot. That memory will last centuries, maybe millennia, because trauma sticks. Same with 9/11s. People who weren't even born yet will know about it. Their grandchildren will know it was traumatic enough, significant enough, shocking enough. The memory won't fade, not for generations. Now scale that back, way back to a time before writing, before cities, before agriculture. Your ancestors lived in small groups, maybe 50 people, maybe 100. Everyone knew everyone. You grew up with the same faces your whole life. Your world was small, contained, predictable. Then the flood came. Maybe it was the Black Sea breakthrough. Maybe it was a tsunami. Maybe it was just sea level rise happening fast enough to notice. Doesn't matter which. What matters is the water rose. Your village flooded. People drowned. Maybe half your community died. Maybe more. You fled inland. Maybe more. You fled inland, left everything behind. Your home, your tools, your food stores, the places you knew, the land your grandparents lived on. All underwater now, all gone. You started over somewhere new, somewhere higher, somewhere safe. That story gets told around fires to children, to grandchildren. We used to live there, where the water is now before it came, before everything changed, before half of us died. Remember this. Don't forget, this is who we are. The story spreads. Other survivors have similar tales, different locations, different details, but the same core event. Water rising, homes flooding, people dying, survivors fleeing. The stories merge, blend together, become one story. The story of the flood. Here's what makes this theory compelling. Flood myths aren't random. They cluster geographically, temporally. They appear in places where flooding actually happened, where sea levels actually rose, where coastlines actually changed. They appear in cultures descended from coastal peoples, from groups who lived near water, who would have experienced flooding firsthand. Indigenous Australian flood myths, describe specific locations, real places now underwater. The stories say these were islands once or coastal plains, now they're ocean. Aboriginal peoples have lived in Australia for 65,000 years. They were there when sea levels rose, when coastlines flooded, when islands disappeared. They remember their stories, remember Pacific Island myths, describe land bridges, connections between islands now submerged. Geologists confirm it. Those land bridges existed during the Ice Age when sea levels were lower. When you could walk between islands, then the ice melted, the bridges flooded, the islands separated. The myths remember Native American flood stories, concentrate in certain regions, coastal areas, river valleys, places where flooding would have been catastrophic. The details vary, but the pattern holds. Floods happened where water could rise, where people lived near shorelines, where sea level change would matter. This isn't coincidence. These is memory encoded in myth, preserved through storytelling, passed down through generations. The details got mythologized. Gods and heroes entered the narrative. Supernatural explanations emerged, but the core remained true. There was a flood. It destroyed our world. We survived. Remember, some researchers think the myths are even older, that they trace back to a single event, one catastrophic flood, so devastating it marked every culture, so traumatic it became universal memory, humanity's shared nightmare. The time we almost didn't make it. The younger dust impact hypothesis suggests something like this. About 12,800 years ago, something hit Earth. Maybe a comet, maybe an asteroid, maybe fragments of both. The impacts triggered wildfires, melted ice sheets, caused rapid sea level rise, created massive flooding, ended the Ice Age abruptly, nearly ended humanity too. The evidence is controversial. Some scientists support it, others don't. But if it happened, it would explain things. Why flood myths are universal. Why they're so similar. Why they all remember the same thing. Because they're all remembering the same event. The day the world flooded. The day everything changed. The day humanity almost died. Even without a single catastrophic event, the theory works. Sea levels rose over thousands of years, but not smoothly, not gradually. There were pulses, sudden jump, periods when melting accelerated, when ice sheets collapsed, when sea levels spiked. Those pulses would have caused flooding, rapid flooding, the kind people notice, the kind people remember. Meltwater pulse 1A happened around 14,600 years ago. Sea levels jumped 50 feet in less than 500 years. That's fast, really fast. Coastlines moved miles inland. Islands vanished, river deltas flooded. People fled. People died. People remembered. Meltwater pulse 1B happened around 11,300 years ago. Another spike, another 25 feet, more flooding, more displacement, more trauma, more memory. Each pulse would have created flood stories. Each coastal group affected would have developed myths. Those myths would have spread, merged, evolved, become the universal flood narrative we see today. The memory survived because it had to, because forgetting would be dangerous, because knowing where the water was, where it came from, how high it rose, that knowledge kept people safe, kept them away from vulnerable coastlines, kept them prepared for future floods. The myths weren't just stories, they were warnings, they were survival information. They were maps of danger encoded in narrative, preserved through repetition, passed down through generations. This is what water can do. This is how high it can rise. This is why we live here, now, away from the coast, away from the danger, away from where our ancestors drowned. That's why the memory survived. Not because someone wrote it down, not because it was interesting, because it was necessary, because remembering meant survival, because forgetting meant death. We are the descendants of the people who remembered, who listened to the warnings, who learned from the past, who understood that water rises, that floods happen, that the world changes, that survival requires memory. The myths are that memory preserved, protected, passed down, changed by time, but never forgotten. Because forgetting would mean losing the lesson, losing the warning, losing the knowledge that kept our ancestors alive. Every culture remembers the flood because every culture experienced it in some form at some time. And those who survived made sure their children knew, made sure their grandchildren knew, made sure their grandchildren knew, made sure nobody ever forgot. That's how memory works. That's how myths survive. That's why we're still telling these stories thousands of years later. Still remembering, still warning, still preserving the knowledge that once, long ago, the world flooded and we survived. When you zoom in, the story gets even stranger. The global floods weren't one big event. They happened in different places at different times in different ways. Some floods lasted days. Some stretched out over generations. Some came with storms. Some followed earthquakes or landslides. There wasn't just one kind of disaster. There were many, all unique, all terrifying in their own way. Let's start with river floods. These are probably the most familiar. Rivers overflowed their banks every year. Sometimes that was good. The floods brought rich soil. Crops grew better after the water went down. Ancient Egypt depended on the Nile's flood. The whole civilization ran on that rhythm. When the river rose, life was good. When it didn't, there was famine. But sometimes the flood wasn't gentle. It wasn't the normal rise and fall. Occasionally the water came too high, too fast. It destroyed everything. Homes washed away. Fields turned to mud. People drowned or fled. The normal rules didn't apply. The safe places weren't safe anymore. The Yellow River in China is a great example. It's called China's Sorrow for a reason. The river changed course many times, sometimes overnight. Huge floods would wipe out villages. Thousands or even millions of people lost their lives. The survivors started. Over again and again. Each time the story grew. Each time the memory of disaster got stronger. The Indus Valley in what's now Pakistan and northwest India was built along a river too. Archaeologists have found layers of mud in the ruins of cities like Mohenjo-daro. The mud tells a story, flood after flood. People rebuilt, then flooded again, over and over. Eventually, the city was abandoned, too much water, too many disasters. The survivors moved on, but they remembered. And then there are the coastal floods. These are different. They're not about rivers, they're about the ocean. Sometimes a big storm pushes cedar over the land. Sometimes the wind and tide work together. Water pours into places that should be dry. Salt water kills crops. Fish swim in the streets. People scramble for high ground. These floods can happen fast, or they can creep in over days driven by wind and waves. Sometimes the sea doesn't just rise and fall, it rushes in like a wall. Tsunamis. These are some of the worst natural disasters ever recorded. Imagine living on the coast. You feel the ground shake. Maybe you don't think much of it. Then, hours later, the ocean pulls back farther than you've ever seen. Fish flop on the sand. The water is gone. People run out to collect them. They don't realize what's coming. A few minutes later, a wave taller than the tallest trees crashes ashore. It sweeps away everything. People, animals, houses, trees, all gone. In 2004, a tsunami hit Indonesia, Sri Lanka, and parts of India and Thailand. Over 200,000 people died. That's today with modern warnings and technology. Imagine something like that thousands of years ago. No warning, no escape, only memory. Japan has stories about tsunamis that go back hundreds, even thousands of years. There are stone markers on the hillsides. They say, "Do not build below this point." The people who survived left warnings. They wanted their children to remember. Stay high. Stay safe. Sometimes the flood isn't water from the ocean or river. Sometimes it's the land itself that moves. Landslides can block rivers. Water backs up behind the debris. Then suddenly the dam breaks. All that water rushes downstream. It happens in mountains. It happens in valleys. The result is the same. A wall of water, mud, rocks, and trees, sweeping away anything in its path. One of the biggest landslide floods happened in China in 1786. An earthquake triggered a landslide that blocked the Dardu River. The water built up behind the debris for 10 days. Then the dam collapsed. The flood raced downstream at terrifying speed. It destroyed dozens of villages. Tens of thousands of lives were lost in hours. The memory of that event still lingers in local stories. Glacial floods are another kind. When glaciers melt, they sometimes form big lakes, held back by ice or rock. If the dam breaks, the water bursts out all at once. These floods can be huge. They can travel for miles. In Iceland, there's even a word for it, jökull. It means glacier run. The water can carve out valleys, destroy everything in its path, and change landscapes forever. In North America, after the last period of ice, there was a glacial lake called Lake Missoula. It covered parts of Montana, Idaho, and Washington. The lake was held back by a wall of ice. Every so often, the ice dam collapsed. Billions of gallons of water rushed out. The floods were so massive they carved canyons, moved giant boulders, and shaped the land in ways you can still see today. The people who lived in these places saw the land change in front of their eyes. Forests vanished. Rivers found new paths. Land that was safe became a lake. The survivors didn't just move. They carried stories with them, stories about the day the world changed, stories about water swallowing the land. Even in places far from the sea, there were floods. The Caspian Sea is the largest enclosed body of water on Earth. It's not connected to the ocean, but its level has shifted wildly over time. Sometimes the shoreline moved miles. Settlements that were once safe ended up underwater. The same thing happened in the Persian Gulf. What's now water used to be dry land dotted with rivers and lakes. People lived there. They left behind tools and hearth. Then the waters came. The old land vanished. In South America, the Amazon River is famous for its floods. During the rainy season, the river spreads out for miles. Forest turns to swamp. Villages become islands. People have learned to live with it. They build houses on stilts. They tie boats to their doorsteps. But every so often, a flood comes that's bigger than anyone remembers. It destroys everything that's been built. Afterwards, the people tell the story. They warn their children. They start over. Australia has its own flood stories. Aboriginal Australians remember times when the coast was farther out, when you could walk to islands that are now surrounded by ocean, when rivers cut through land that's now underwater. Some of their stories match what geologists have found. They describe landscapes you can't see anymore, but the memory remains. In Africa, the Nile isn't the only river that floods. The Niger, the Congo, the Zambezi all have their own rhythms. People learn to expect the water, but sometimes the river changes its mind. Floods come at the wrong time. Too high, too long. Settlements vanish, fields disappear. The survivors remember the Americas have more than just the Amazon. The Mississippi River has flooded again and again. In 1927, a huge flood covered 27,000 square miles. Hundreds of thousands lost their homes. That's in living memory. But floods, like it happened before. Indigenous peoples in North America had stories about great floods. The details different. Sometimes it's rain, sometimes the river, sometimes a giant beaver or trickster spirit is to blame, but always the water whines. What ties all these events together? It's the pattern. Not every place flooded at the same time. Not every flood was global, but almost everywhere, people experienced water rising, land disappearing, and lives being turned upside down. These weren't gentle changes. They were disasters. Sometimes sudden, sometimes slow, but always powerful enough to leave a mark. The details of each story depend on the land. In river valleys, the myth is about angry rivers or rain that never stops. On the coast, it's about the sea swallowing the land. In the mountains, it's lakes breaking free or glaciers bursting. Sometimes the stories include animals, sometimes gods, sometimes just the water itself, acting like a living thing. As people moved, they carried these memories with them. When they settled new land, they told their children about the dangers. Don't build too close to the river. Don't trust the calm sea. Watch for signs in the clouds. Listen for the ground rumbling. These lessons became traditions. Then they became stories. Then, over time, they turned into myths. It's easy to think of myths as just stories. But for ancient people, they were more than that. They were warnings. They were survival guides. They explained why things were the way they were, why the land was shaped a certain way, why there were shells on top of mountains, why there were giant boulders in the middle of a field. The answer was always the same. The flood put them there. As societies grew, the stories changed. New gods appeared. Old details got dropped or twisted, but the core stayed the same. Water came, things were lost, people survived. Remembering that was important. It wasn't just about fear, it was about respect. Respect for the power of nature, for forces bigger than any one person or group. Sometimes the stories got tied to real stories, places. In Greece, there's a cave called the Cave of Deucalion. Local people say it's where the survivors of the flood hid. In India, there's a temple on a hill in Gujarat. The legend says Manu's boat landed there after the flood. In China, stories about Yu, the great taming the floods, are linked to real rivers and dams. Even today, people make pilgrimages to these places. The memory is alive. Other times, the memory is hidden in rituals. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile was celebrated with festivals. In Mesopotamia, the king performed ceremonies to keep the river gods happy. In the Americas, ceremonies mark the start and end of rainy seasons. These were more than parties. They were ways of dealing with fear, ways of asking for safety, ways of saying we remember. What's strange is how the fear details echo across the world. The names change, the landscapes change, but the shape of the story stays the same. Sometimes it's a boat, sometimes a mountain, sometimes an animal, warning people or a god giving a sign. But always the story ends with survivors looking at a changed world, starting over. Why does this matter? Here's the thing that keeps me curious. You can't see trauma in the rocks. You can't measure fear with a ruler, but you can see it in stories, in myths passed down for hundreds of generations, in warnings carved on stones, in places nobody dares to build even when the land looks safe. It shows how people learned from disaster, how memory became a tool for survival, how telling the right story could save lives long after the event itself was forgotten. That's why these stories outlasted everything else. Not because they were fun to tell, but because they mattered. We don't know every detail. We'll never know exactly what happened, or where, or when, but we can follow the clues. We can look at drowned cities, lost valleys, and strange stones on mountaintops. We can listen to the myths and see what they remember. Sometimes the stories are the only map we have, and that's the real power of regional flood myths. They're not just echoes of fear. They're echoes of survival, of people facing disaster, learning what they could, and passing the lesson forward. The next time the river rose or the sea crept in, someone remembered. Someone listened. Someone survived. Now we look back and see the pattern. Flood stories in every culture, each one a piece of a bigger puzzle. Each one a memory of water, of loss, of starting over. When you add them together, you don't just get a list of disasters. You get a map of human resilience, a record of people who refuse to forget. That's why the myth of the flood is everywhere. Because floods really happened, because they survive. Oars made sure nobody forgot, not just for their own sake, but for everyone who came after, for us. And there's still more. Some people think there was a single massive flood, something sudden, something that changed the world overnight. Could one event explain all these stories, or are we seeing many smaller disasters, each one shaping a piece of the myth? To answer that, we have to look at the biggest theories, the ones that talk about impacts from space, rapid melting events so huge they'd shake the whole planet. That's where we're headed next. From the slow rise of water to sudden catastrophe, from regional floods to the possibility of a single night when everything changed. The kind of event that could haunt humanity forever. Here's where the flood stories take a turn. We've talked about disasters that happened in one place or another. Rivers overflowing, seas crashing inland, lakes bursting. Those are real events. You can still see their scars on the land. But what if there was something even bigger? Something that didn't just change one valley or one coastline, but shook the world. That's the theory some scientists and storytellers have chased for years. A truly global disaster. Not just a flood here or there, but an event so huge it would be remembered everywhere. A flood that would become a legend in every corner of the Earth. Let's start with the idea of a comet or asteroid hitting Earth. It sounds like science fiction, but it's happened before. Around 66 million years ago, a giant asteroid crashed into what's now Mexico. That's the impact that wiped out the dinosaurs. It didn't just make a big hole, it set off wildfires, sent clouds of dust around the world, blocked the sun, and changed the climate. Most living things didn't survive. That was long before humans, but the idea is the same. A single event so powerful, it changes everything. Now what about more recent times? Some researchers think something like this happened near the end of the last ice period. They call it the Younger Dust Impact Hypothesis. Here's how it goes. Around 12,800 years ago, the world was warming up. Ice sheets were shrinking. Then suddenly things changed. The warming stopped. Temperatures dropped fast. For about 1,200 years, the planet got colder again. This period is called the Younger Dryas. Nobody knows exactly why it happened, but one idea is that something crashed into Earth. Maybe a comet, maybe a swarm of smaller pieces. The impact would have set off wildfires, sent dust into the air, and blocked sunlight. Crops wouldn't grow. Animals would die. People would have to move or starve. There's some evidence for this. Scientists have found a thin layer in the soil from that time. In this layer, there are tiny glass beads like what you get from a high-energy impact. There's also a spike in platinum, which is rare on Earth but common in space rocks. Some sites show signs of burning, as if huge fires swept the land. In North America, many large animals disappeared right around then. Mammoths, giant sloths, saber-toothed cats, all gone. Some people think the impact caused these extinctions along with the sudden cold. If something like this happened, it would have caused chaos everywhere. Ice sheets would melt in strange patterns. Lakes could burst. Rivers would flood. Weather would shift. Imagine living through that. One day things are getting warmer. The next winter comes roaring back. Herds vanish. Plants wither. The land itself changes. Plants wither. The land itself changes. You'd remember it. Your children would remember it. The story would never die. But there's a catch. Not every scientist agrees. Some say the layer of glass beads and platinum could come from volcanoes or other sources. Others point out that the timing doesn't line up perfectly everywhere. The debate is still arcing. No one has found a giant crater from 12,800 years ago. At least not yet. So, while the impact theory is exciting, it's not proven. Still, it shows how one huge event could change everything, and how people might turn that memory into a myth. Now, let's look at another big idea: the sudden release of water from giant lakes. At the end of the last ice period, the world was full of meltwater lakes. These were lakes trapped behind walls of ice or rock. As the ice sheets melted, the lakes grew bigger and bigger. Sometimes the ice dam holding them back would fail. When that happened, the water would burst out all at once. Not a trickle or a slow rise, but a flood moving faster than a racing car. These floods didn't just wreck the land nearby. They could change coastlines, carve out new rivers, and even affect the global climate. One of the best examples is Glacial Lake Agassiz. This lake sat in what's now Canada and parts of the northern United States. At its largest, it covered more than 170,000 square miles. That's bigger than all of the Great Lakes combined. The lake was held back by ice. When the dam broke, all that water rushed north, east or south, sometimes into the Arctic Ocean, sometimes into the Atlantic Ocean, sometimes into the Atlantic, sometimes down the Mississippi. Each time it sent a wave of fresh water pouring into the ocean. This could have changed sea currents and even weather patterns across the world. Some scientists think one of these floods might explain why the climate shifted so quickly during the Younger Dust. Suddenly, cold water floods the North Atlantic. Ocean currents slow down or stop. Warmth from the tropics doesn't move north anymore. The temperature drops. It's like flipping a switch on the world's weather. People living near these floods would have seen their world turned upside down. Forests drowned. Animals disappeared. Rivers changed direction. It would feel like the end of the world. These floods weren't just in North America. In Europe, huge lakes formed in front of the melting ice. Sometimes these lakes burst through. The North Sea was once dry land. When the water broke through, it filled up fast. Britain became an island. The people living there must have seen the sea rushing in, swallowing forests and fields. They left, but the memories stayed the same. Thing happened in Asia. In Siberia, giant lakes drained into the Arctic. In Central Asia, the Caspian and Aral seas grew and shrank with the climate. Every time the water shifted, people had to adapt. Some left, some rebuilt, some told stories about the day the water came. Now, let's consider another theory: massive volcanic eruptions. Volcanoes can cause floods, but not always with water. Sometimes a volcano erupts under a glacier. The heat melts the ice. Suddenly, a wall of water comes rushing out. In Iceland, this is called a jakuleb. It's happened many times. The water can move so fast it sweeps away everything in its path. People who survived would never forget it. Volcanoes can also change the climate. When a big one blows, it sends ash and gas into the sky. The sun gets blocked, temperatures drop, crops fail. In 1815, the volcano Tambora erupted in Indonesia. The next year, 1816, was called the Year Without a Summer. It snowed in June in New England. People starved, livestock died. That was just one eruption in recorded history. Think how much worse it would be if something like that happened when humans depended on hunting and wild plants. If food vanished, people would move or die. The survivors would tell the story for generations. Some myths talk about fire and water together, destruction from both at once. Maybe these stories remember times when a volcano caused floods, or when fire and water mixed in disaster. The Earth can do that. It's not just one thing at a time. Then there's the theory about rapid sea level rise, sometimes called a meltwater pulse. This isn't just a gentle rise over centuries. In some periods, the ocean jumped up by several feet in just a few decades. This happened when big chunks of ice broke off and melted quickly. Imagine living near the coast. 1 year the sea is far away. 10 years later, it's at your doorstep. 20 years after that, your village is underwater. People would have to move fast. They lose their homes, their fields, their sacred places. The shock would last for generations. Archaeologists have found signs of this. In the Persian Gulf, there are old riverbeds deep under the water. People lived there, but as the sea rose, they had to leave. In the Mediterranean, ancient cities are now underwater. In the Caribbean, huge underwater caves contain the bones of animals and people. Proof that the land was once dry. The sea came in and everything changed. Some scientists think these rapid rises could explain why flood stories are so common. It's not just the slow change people can see and get used to, it's the sudden, shocking loss. One generation remembers the land, the next only knows the water. The story becomes legend, the legend becomes myth. There's another theory about the Black Sea. We touched on it before, but here's the twist. Some geologists think the Black Sea flood wasn't just a local event. They believe it was so sudden and so huge that it sent people running in every direction. If true, the flood could have pushed early farmers out of the region. Those people would have carried their memories and their stories with them into Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. The theory goes that these migrants spread the flood myth as they moved. It's a big idea. Not everyone agrees, but if it happened, it would help explain why so many cultures in that part of the world have similar stories. Now, let's zoom out and talk about memory itself. Why do some disasters become myths? Why do others fade away? Memory is strange. People remember what hurts. They remember what shocks them. They remember what makes them feel small. A single flood might wash away a village, but the story could grow over time. The next time disaster strikes, the story gets retold. Details get added. Fear mixes with memory. After a few generations, the event becomes bigger than life. But sometimes a real event is so huge that it doesn't need to be exaggerated. If you saw the ocean pouring in, if you watched your world vanish, you'd never forget. You'd tell anyone who'd listen. You'd warn them. That's how legends grow. That's how myth becomes a tool for survival. Scientists have tried to figure out if there was one event that explains all the flood stories. Some say yes, a single world-shaking disaster. Others say no, they think it's a pattern. Many smaller events repeated again and again all over the world. The details change, but the feeling is the same. Loss, fear, survival, hope. There's a lesson here. The earth is always changing. Sometimes it moves slowly. Sometimes everything shifts at once. People have always had to adapt. Sometimes they do it by moving. Sometimes by rebuilding. Sometimes by rebuilding. Sometimes by remembering. The stories are like road signs pointing backwards in time. This happened here. Beware. The water came. It could come again. We survived. You can too. It's easy to look at myths and see only fantasy. Boats that hold every animal. God sending rain for weeks. Mountains rising above the flood. But behind the magic, there's real fear, real memory, real loss. The stories aren't just entertainment. They are a way to make sense of the world, to find meaning in disaster, to pass down warnings in a way people won't forget. Think about this. If you survived something huge, how would you explash in it to your children? You'd want them to understand the danger. You'd want them to respect the signs. Maybe you'd exaggerate a little to make sure they listened. Maybe you'd add heroes and gods to give them hope. The story would change as it was told and retold, but the heart of it would stay the same. That's why these theories matter. They show us how memory works. They show us how people turn disaster into a lesson, how they use stories to heal, to warn, to shape the future. Some scientists dig for evidence. Some study old texts. Some listen to the myth. They're all looking for the same thing, a way to connect the past to the present. Here's something else to think about. The flood stories aren't just about water. They're about survival, about starting over when everything is lost, about trusting that life will go on even when the world seems broken. That's the part that lasts. That's why the stories are still with us. So, what's the answer? Was there one big flood or many small ones? Was it a comet, a burst lake, a rising sea, or all of the above? Maybe we'll never know for sure. Maybe the truth is a mix of everything. The earth is full of surprises. People are good at remembering what matters. Sometimes the only way to hold on to a lesson is to turn it into a story. And that's the real impact of the flood myth. It's a map of loss drawn in memory. It's a warning and a promise. It says, pay attention. The world can change in a moment. It says, if disaster comes, remember what we learned. Start again. Now, we've looked at the science. We've seen floods, impacts, and eruptions. But there's more to the story. Next, we'll look at the psychology. Why do humans even today keep telling these stories? Why do they matter so much? That's where we're headed, from the facts to the feelings, from the outside world to the inside world. Why we remember, why we dream of flow, odds even when the water is far away. Let's take a different approach. We've looked at the floods themselves. What happened out there in the world? Now, let's look at what happens inside us. Why do these stories stick? Why do floods out of all disasters show up in so many myths? Why not earthquakes or droughts or fire? There's something about water, about being swept away that gets into our minds and stays there. It's more than just fear. It's something deep, something in how humans are wired to remember. Think about how memory works. We don't remember every day. We remember the days that changed us, the days when something shocking happened. You probably remember where you were when you heard big news. You remember the day you moved or the day you lost someone or the time you almost got hurt. Your brain pays attention to what matters for survival. That's how it's built. When something huge happens, a flood that wipes out everything you know, your mind takes a snapshot. It keeps that picture close, ready to warn you if anything like it starts to happen again. This isn't just about survival for one person. It's about survival for the whole group. People share stories to protect each other. Stories about danger get passed around. The ones that stick are the ones that feel important. The ones that could save your life next time. So when a flood destroys a village, the story isn't just told once. It's told again and again. Parents tell their children. Elders warn the young. Watch the river. Don't trust the calm. The water can rise without warning. The story becomes a lesson. Sometimes it becomes a rule. Eventually, it's a myth. Psychologists have a name for this. They call it flash bulb memory. It means a memory that's so sharp, so clear, it feels like a photograph in your mind. It's the kind of memory that comes with strong feelings. Fear, shock, loss. These memories don't fade easily. They get retold. Every time someone tells the story, it gets a little stronger. It becomes part of who you are and who your people are. But here's where it gets interesting. Not every disaster becomes a myth. Some are forgotten. Some are remembered only in small ways. Why do floods stand out? One reason is that water is everywhere. We need it to live. It gives life, but it can also take life away. It's not an enemy, but it's not a friend either. It's something you have to respect. When it turns dangerous, it feels like the whole world is against you. The ground you trusted vanishes. Your home disappears. Everything floats away. That sense of total loss and total helplessness hits hard. It's not like a fire where you can sometimes fight back. It's not like a drought which creeps in slowly. A flood can come with no warning. One day, everything's normal. The next, it's all gone. That sudden change is frightening. It's the kind of thing your brain refuses to forget. Now, let's look at how humans deal with fear and the unknown. People don't like to feel powerless. When something huge happens, we look for reasons. We tell stories to explain it. Sometimes those stories involve gods or spirits or fate. Why did the flood happen? Maybe the gods were angry. Maybe we broke a rule. If you can give the disaster a reason, you feel like you can avoid it next time. You make rules. Don't anger the river. Don't build too close to the shore. The story becomes a guide for how to live. There's another side to this. Flood stories aren't just warnings. They're also about hope. Most flood myths end the same way. A few survive. They build again. The world starts over. That's a powerful idea. It means that even when everything is lost, life can return. People need that hope. It's not just about what was destroyed, it's about what comes after. So, let's talk about how these stories gray. Ow. When one person tells a story, they shape it a little. They add details. Maybe they make it bigger. Maybe they make it scarier. Or maybe they add a hero, a person who saves others or outsmarts the disaster. Over generations, the story changes. What started as a memory of a real flood becomes something more. It becomes a legend, then a myth. This is called myth-making. It's something every culture does. It's how we turn memories into stories and stories into lessons. Myths aren't just made-up tales. They're ways to explain big, confusing events. They help people feel less alone. If your ancestors survived a flood and you hear the story, you feel connected to them. You feel stronger. You know that survival is possible. Let's look at some examples. In many Native American stories, the flood is sent as a test. The people who listen to the warnings survive. The people who ignore them are swept away. The lesson is clear. Pay attention to the world. Don't get too comfortable. Disaster can come when you least expect it. In the story of Manu from India, it's a fish who gives the warning. That's unusual. A fish is a messenger, but it makes sense. Who knows more about water than a fish? The story teaches that help can come from unlikely places, and that you have to listen carefully to the world around you. In ancient Greece, the survivors of the flood, Duslan and Pyrrha, throw stones over their shoulders to create new people. It's a strange detail, but it shows something important. Out of destruction comes creation. Even after the worst disaster, you can start again. Something new can grow from what's left. Why are these stories so similar, even in places that never met? Here's a theory. Humans everywhere have the same basic brain structure. We feel fear. We want answers. We need hope. When faced with disaster, we reach for the same kinds of stories. Water destroys, but it also purifies. A flood can be an ending, but it's also a new beginning. These are ideas that make sense on a deep level no matter where you live. There's another idea called archetypes. It means certain symbols and story patterns show up in many cultures. Carl Jung, a famous psychologist, wrote about this. He believed that some stories come from shared human experience, not just from history. The flood for him was one of those symbols. It's about washing away the old, making room for the new. It's about chaos turning into order. Not everyone agrees with Jung, but you can see his point. The same kinds of stories appear again and again in places far apart. Maybe it's because people face similar disasters, or maybe it's because our minds work in similar ways. Either way, the flood story is one of those patterns that keeps coming back. Let's talk about fear for a moment. Fear is powerful. It makes us pay attention. It makes us pay attention. It makes us remember, but it also makes us creative. When we're afraid, we imagine what could happen next. We look for ways to avoid danger. We invent explanations. We come up with rules. That's how myths grow. They're not just stories about the past. They're tools for the future. In some flood myths, the disaster comes as a punishment. The people did something wrong, and the flood is the consequence. In other stories, the flood is just random, a force of nature with no reason behind it. That difference matters. If disaster is punishment, you can avoid it by behaving well. If it's random, you have to stay alert. You have to be ready for anything. Both kinds of stories help people cope. If you believe you can control the future by following rules, you feel safer. If you believe the world is unpredictable, you might focus on being prepared. Either way, the myth gives you something to hold on to. There's a deeper layer, too. Flood myths are often about cleansing. The woe, ruled, is full of problems, crime, sickness, chaos. The flood comes, wipes everything clean, starts over. It's a scary idea, but also a hopeful one. Maybe things can get better. Maybe the world can be fixed. Children learn these stories early. They hear them from parents, teachers, storytellers. The stories stick because they're dramatic, but also because they make sense of things that are hard to understand. Why do bad things happen? Why do good people suffer? The flood myth offers an answer, even if it's not a simple one. There's also something about the rhythm of the story. Water rises, everything is lost. Then there's a pause. A boat floats. A mountaintop appears. Life begins again. It's like breathing. In, out, loss, renewal. That rhythm feels natural. Maybe that's why the myth is so easy to remember. Let's not forget the role of community. When a disaster happens, people come together. They help each other. They help each other. They rebuild. They share memories. Telling the flood story is a way to stay connected. It's a reminder that you're not alone. Others have faced disaster and survived. So can you? Some researchers think flood myths are a way to explain the unknown. Ancient people didn't have science the way we do now. When they saw strange things, fossils on mountaintops, shells far from the sea, they needed a reason. A flood explained it. Once the sea covered everything, that's why these shells are here. The story fills the gap left by mystery. There are also stories where the flood is not just a disaster, but a gift. The land is made more fertile. New animals appear. Life is hard, but also richer. It's not just about fear. It's about transformation. Let's look at dreams for a second. Floods show up in dreams all the time, even for people who have never seen one. Psychologists say dreams about water often mean big feelings, anxiety, change, the unknown. Maybe deep down we all caw. Read the memory of ancient floods. Maybe the myth is alive inside us even now. In modern times, when big disasters happen, people still tell stories. Think about hurricanes, tsunamis, even big storms. Survivors share their memories. The story spreads. Sometimes the details get mixed up, but the feeling remains. Shock, fear, hope, the need to understand. There's a pattern in how people talk about these events. They look for meaning. Why did this happen to us? Sometimes they say it's a warning. Sometimes they see it as a chance to start over. This is the same process that turned ancient floods into myths. What strikes me most is how these stories bring people together. Across cultures, across time, the flood myth connects us. It's a reminder that we're all vulnerable, but also that we can rebuild, we can start again. So, what does all this mean? It means that flood myths are more than memories. They're maps for living. They warn us, comfort us, and help us make sense of things we can't control. They teach us to respect nature, to watch for changes, and to trust that survival is possible. Even today, when we hear about rising seas or strange weather, something stirs inside. We remember the old stories even if we don't realize it. Part of us is always watching the water, ready to run, ready to rebuild. The myth lives on, not just in old books or temples, but in our minds. Now we've explored the deep reasons why flood myths last. We've seen how memory, fear, hope, and community all play a part. But what about the stories themselves? What do they actually say? How do the details compare? That's where we're heading next. We'll dive into the myths side by side and see what secrets they still hold. Let's start with the best-known version, the flood in the book of Genesis. Most people know the basics: Noah, the ark, the animals 2 by 2. But if you look closer, the details are range and specific. According to the story, God warns Noah about a coming flood. He tells him to build a giant boat, big enough for his family and for pairs of every animal. The rain falls for 40 days and nights. Water covers the highest mountains. Everything not on the boat dies. After months drifting on endless water, Noah sends out a bird. It returns at first, no land. Later, it comes back with an olive branch. The waters are going down. Finally, the boat settles on a mountain. The survivors leave the ark and start the world over. Now, what's interesting is how many little details appear over and over. The warning, the giant boat, the total destruction, the survivors and the animals, the sending out of birds, even the mountaintop. These aren't just general ideas. They're repeated in other stories in other places by people who never met each other. Take the Sumerian version. This story was written down long before Genesis on clay tablets over 4,000 years old. Here the hero is called Utnapishtim. He's warned by the god that the other gods plan to flood the world. He's told to build a large boat and fill it with his family, craftsmen and animals. When the flood comes, It's wild, wind, rain, darkness, water rising fast. After 7 days, the storm ends. Utnapishtim's boat comes to rest on a mountain. He also sends out birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven to see if the land is dry. When the birds don't return, he knows it's safe. Sound familiar? The match isn't perfect, but it's close enough that you have to wonder. Movies to India. There, the oldest flood story is told in the Satapa Brahmanana, an ancient Hindu text. In this version, a man named Manu is washing his hands in a river. A tiny fish begs him for protection. Manu puts the fish in a jar, then moves it to a pond, then to a river. As it grows bigger and bigger, eventually the fish reveals itself as the god Vishnu. It warns Manu about a flood that will wipe out all life. He's told to build a boat and take seeds of all plants and pairs of all creatures. The flood comes. The fish, now huge, tows Manu's boat to safety. When the water goes down, Manu starts humanity again. Look at those details. The warning, the boat, the saving of life, the rising water, the world, starting over. Even the idea of a helper from the water. A fish fits the pattern, but with a local twist. Different culture, different gods, but the same basic shape. Now, let's go west to Greece. Here the flood myth features Deucalion and Pyrrha. Zeus, the king of the gods, decides humans have become too wicked. He sends a flood to wipe them out. Prometheus, a god who likes humans, warns his son Deucalion. Build a chest, he says. Deucalion and his wife Pur climb in with a Y. Supplies. The rain pours down for 9 days and nights. Nothing but water. When the rain stops, their chest comes to rest on a mountain, Mount Parnassus. When the water finally goes down, Deucalion and Pyrrha are the only people left. They repopulate the earth by throwing stones behind them, which turn into people. Again, we see the warning, the building of something to float, survival of a chosen few, and a new start after the flood. The stone-throwing detail is odd, but it fits the pattern of creation from destruction. It's a hopeful twist. Life coming from barren ground. China has its own version, but it's different in some ways. Instead of a single world-ending flood, the stories talk about endless chaos caused by rising water. In some versions, a hero named Yu is given the task of controlling the floods. He spends years digging channels, draining the land, and creating order from chaos. He doesn't build a boat. He doesn't wait for the waters to go down. He works to tame the water and save his people. This story stands out because it's more about human effort, than divine punishment, but the core is similar. An overwhelming flood, a threat to survival, and the start of something new when the danger passes. The myth of Yu the Great is so important that he's remembered as the founder of China's first dynasty. Let's look at another continent, North America. Many Native American groups remember a giant flood. The specifics change from tribe to tribe, but the pattern holds. In some stories, a trickster figure warns the people. In others, animals play a big part. The Ojibwe remember a flood that covers the world with only Nanabojo, the trickster, and a few animals surviving on a floating log. They send animals to dive down and bring up mud. Finally, a muskrat succeeds. From that mud, land is recreated. The survivors begin again. In South America, the Inca and their neighbors told stories of water rising to cover the land, leaving only a few people alive. Sometimes the survivors climb a high mountain. Sometimes they hide inside caves. Sometimes they're saved by a warning from a god or spirit. When the water goes down, life returns. Let's zoom out and compare what these stories have in common. First, most of them start with a warning. The hero is told by a god, an animal, or a dream that disaster is coming. Second, there's usually a way to survive. Some kind of boat, chest, or mountaintop. Third, the destruction is complete. Everything is wiped away except for a small group. Fourth, there's a fresh start. The survivors rebuild, often with help from animals or gods. Now the differences are just as revealing. Some stories focus on punishment. Humans did something wrong, so the flood comes to cleanse the world. Others focus on chaos, water as a wild force that needs to be controlled. Some are about rescue, an act of mercy, a chance to start again. In some, animals are heroes. In others, it's a single human who saves the day. But the story, bones of the story, remain the same. Why do you think so many details match? It's tempting to believe there was one giant event remembered everywhere. But there's another way to look at it. Humans everywhere face floods. Rivers overflow. Rain falls harder than expected. Sometimes everything is swept away. The memory of those moments is strong. The stories grow in the telling. Over time, the small local story becomes bigger, more dramatic, more universal. Some researchers think the similarities come from a shared way of thinking. When people face a huge disaster, they look for ways to explain it. They try to find patterns to make sense of what happened. The flood, as an idea, is powerful enough to cross mountains, oceans, and centuries, but there are also unique details that show how each group made the story their own. In Mesopotamia, the boat is huge, 7 stories high, with 6 decks. In the Hebrew story, the number 40 appears again and again. 40 days of rain, 40 nights, 40 days waiting for the mountain to appear. In the Hindu story, the fish is the helper. In Native American stories, animals do the saving. These twists are not random. They fit the landscape, the values, and the daily life of each culture. Let's dig into the numbers for a minute. The Sumerian flood tablets date back to around 2100 BCE. The Genesis account was written much later, probably around 600 BCE. Though the stories are older, the Indian texts mentioning Manu are hard to date, but some go back as far as 1000 BCE. Chinese flood legends about Yu the Great are at least 4,000 years old, maybe older. The Native American stories are hard to date, since they were passed down by word of mouth, but some researchers think they go back at least several thousand years. That means these stories have been told and retold for up to 4,000 years, maybe more. They survived not just in books, but in songs, rituals, and daily life. For some groups, the flood, myth, is at the heart of their creation story. The reason the world looks the way it does. Now, here's something most people miss. In many stories, the flood is not just about destruction. It's about the world being made new. In the Sumerian version, the gods regret sending the flood. They grant Utnapishtim and his wife immortality as a reward for surviving. In Genesis, God makes a promise. Never again will a flood destroy the world. The rainbow is the sign of that promise. In the Greek story, the survivors are told to repopulate the earth. In the Ojibwe story, the muskrat's mud is the seed for the new world. There's a cycle: loss, survival, and rebirth. Not every flood story is global. Some are local, tied to a single valley or river. The Murray of New Zealand, remember, a flood that covered their land. But it's not the whole world, just their world. Aboriginal Australians remember water rising to cover the coast, but their stories are about specific places. These stories feel just as real, just as powerful, but the scale changes. Let's look at what's missing. There are very few ancient myths about drought or fire that follow the same pattern: total destruction, a single survivor, a new start. Earthquakes are remembered, but not as world-ending events. Floods, on the other hand, keep coming back. Maybe it's because water is both friend and enemy. Maybe it's because when water covers your world, it feels like nothing can survive. Or maybe it's just that floods leave such a clear mark: mud, silt, ruined homes, washed out land. Sometimes flood stories include elements that sound impossible. In the Genesis story, the water covers mountains. In the Sumerian story, the boat is the size of a small building. In Native American stories, animals dive to the bottom of the sea and bring up land. These details are hard to believe if you take them literally, but if you see them as symbols, they make sense. They're about survival against all odds, about hope when everything seems lost. There's another pattern worth noticing. Many flood myths include a test. The survivors are chosen, warned, or saved because they did something right. They listened, they were kind, or they followed the rules. The people who didn't listen are lost. The lesson is clear. Pay attention. Be good. Respect the forces around you. Now, let's talk about the role of memory. Scholars think that for a story to last this long, it has to be useful. It has to explain something, teach something, or help people survive. Flood myths do all three. They explain why there are seashells on mountains. They teach people to watch for danger. They help groups bond over shared survival. The myth becomes a kind of tool passed down for safety, as much as for comfort. Here's a little-known fact. In the Middle East, where the oldest flood stories come from, archaeologists have found layers of clay and mud in ancient cities. These layers are sometimes several feet thick, with signs of sudden, violent flooding. In the city there's a layer of silt that matches the time when the Sumerian flood story was first written. Not proof of a world-ending flood, but evidence that huge floods did happen and left scars in the earth. But what about places with no big rivers? Some, like the Pacific Islands, tell flood stories too. The difference is, their floods come from the ocean. Sometimes the sea rises without warning. Sometimes a wave, a tsunami, washes over the land. The survivors climb the highest hill or sail to another island. They remember the wave, not the river, but the rest of the story is the same. Warning, survival, rebirth. Let's pause and think about what all this means. The flood myth isn't just one story. It's hundreds of stories, each with its own flavor, its own heroes, its own lessons. But at the heart of each one is the same question: what happens when the world you know disappears? How do you start again? How do you explain the unexplainable? Maybe the flood stories are a way of dealing with change. Life is uncertain. The things you trust, your home, your land, your people, can vanish in a day. The flood is a symbol of that fear, but it's also a symbol of hope. If others survived, maybe you can too. If they rebuilt, so can you. The myth gives people courage to keep going. What strikes me most is the way these stories grow and change. Every time they're told, something new is added. A new animal, a new hero, a new lesson. The story adapts to fit the world around it, but it never disappears. It's too important. So when you hear a flood myth, whether it's from the Bible, from Sumer, from the Ojibwe, or from an island in the Pacific, you're hearing more than a story. You're hearing a memory of disaster, a lesson about survival, and a promise that life can begin again. And that's why the flood myth keeps showing up. Not because it's just a tale, but because it's a map, a guide for what to do when the world changes. A reminder that starting over is possible even when everything seems lost. Let's take this a step further. Imagine your ancestors sitting around a fire telling the flood story. Maybe it wasn't the same words or even the same language, but the feeling was the same. Fear or hope, and the belief that somehow things would be okay. Maybe that's why even today the flood myth feels real. Maybe it's not just about water. Maybe it's about us, about how we face the unknown, about how we keep going. Next, let's see what these old stories might mean for us now. How the lessons inside them still shape the way we think. Even if we don't notice, let's step back and look at what all these flood stories might mean. Not just the facts or the legends, but what they actually say about us. About who? Man's, about memory, about the things we fear and hope for. People often think that if a story is old, it must be simple. But flood myths are anything but simple. They're packed with layers, ideas about loss, about punishment, about starting over, about the power of nature and the smallness of people. We tend to see them as just tales for children, but if you really pay attention, you start to see how deep they go. First, let's talk about fear. The fear of being swept away. of losing everything is about as old as humanity itself. You don't need to live near a river to feel it. Even today, people have nightmares about water rising, about waves crashing down. Water is life, but it can also be the end of life. Floods erase the map. They take away homes, fields, roads, everything that made a place familiar. That kind of loss is hard to forget. It leaves a mark on the mind, a shape that stories fit into even centuries later. Now, think about how these stories work as warnings. They aren't just about the past. They're a way to keep people safe in the future. If you live near a river, you need to know what happens. When the water rises, you need to remember the signs. You need to teach your kids to listen for danger, to run when the time comes. Stories are one way to make sure people don't forget. If the tale is scary enough, if it's told with enough feeling, it sticks. The lesson becomes part of who you are. It's not just a fact. It's a story about someone who survived or didn't. There's another side to these myths too. They're not all about fear and warning. They're also about hope. The flood comes, but it ends. The world is washed clean, but someone is left alive. Animals, seeds, a family. Someone climbs out of the water and starts again. That's the message that runs through almost every flood myth. No matter how bad things get, there's a chance to rebuild. The rainbow, after the rain. The mountaintop after the storm. Even when it feels impossible, the story says, don't give up. There's a way forward. Let's get a little more specific. Take the idea of the chosen survivor. In most of these stories, not everyone is saved. Someone gets a warning, maybe because they listened, maybe because they were good or just lucky. They build a boat, or find a high place, or get help from a god or animal. The rest of the world is lost, but they make it. That's a powerful idea. It says that paying attention matters, that there's a reward for being careful or kind or wise. It's not just about luck, it's about listening, about being ready when things go wrong. But there's more. In many cultures, the person who survives the flood isn't just a survivor. They become a founder, the first king, the ancestor of a whole people. After the disaster, they set the rules, teach the new ways, start the world over. The flood isn't just an ending, it's a beginning, a kind of reset button for the world. That's why so many flood myths end with a promise from a god or from nature, that it won't happen again, or if it does that, there will be warning, a way to escape. You can see this in the way the stories change over time. Early versions are harsh, everyone but a few are wiped out. Later versions start to soften. There's a rainbow or a promise or a new rule that will keep things safe. The message shifts from pure survival to rebuilding to making things better next time. Now, let's look at the evidence from another angle, the land itself. If you go to places where these stories come from, you often find physical clues, not just in river valleys where floods are common, but in places that are now dry. Fossil shells on mountaintops, layers of mud in places that are far from any sea, ancient harbors buried far from the modern shoreline. Scientists dig up these clay years and try to match them to the stories. Sometimes the match is close, other times it's not, but the ground remembers even if the details are fuzzy. Here's a good example. In the Middle East, you can find layers of silt that date to around the time the oldest flood stories were first written down. In North America, there are ancient beaches far above sea level, marks left when giant lakes burst their banks. In the Indian Ocean, you can find sunken ruins, maybe cities, maybe not, far below the waves. Sometimes the stories line up with the land, sometimes they don't. But the pattern is there. Something big happened, and people remembered. There are even hints in our language. Words for flood are some of the oldest in many languages. Words for boat, ark, raft, and mountain show up in languages that haven't been connected for thousands of years. The words stick because the stories stick. They get passed down even when everything else changes. But why floods and not other disasters? That's the puzzle. Fires destroy too. So do earthquakes and droughts. But those stories don't get told the same way. Maybe it's because water covers everything. It wipes the slate clean. Literally, it's total. When a flood comes, there's nowhere to hide except on the boat, or the mountain, or in the care of a god. The clean sweep is what makes it different. Let's look at the role of animals in these stories. In the Noah story, the animals go 2 by 2. In the Ojibwe tale, it's the muskrat who saves the day. In India, it's a fish who gives the warning. In other places, it's birds who bring news of dry land. Animals are not just extras. They're messengers, helpers, survivors. They remind people that the world is not just human. When life starts over, it's not just people who need saving. The whole world gets a second chance. Here's something else. Flood myths often talk about seeds, about bringing plants on the boat, or saving grain for the future. That's practical. If you're starting over, you need food. You need the basics to survive. The story teaches that too. Don't just save yourself. Think ahead. Bring what you'll need to rebuild. Let's talk about the moral lessons inside these stories. Many flood myths explain the disastrous punishment. People were greedy, violent, or disrespectful. The flood comes to wipe the slate clean. Only the good or the wise or the lucky survive. This isn't just about what happened. It's a warning. Behave or face the same fate. It's society's way of teaching right and wrong. The lesson is clear. Respect the forces you can't control. Don't take the world for granted, but not all flood stories are about punishment. Some are about chaos and order. The world starts as water, wild and untamed. A hero brings order, drains the water, builds canals, brings life back. In these versions, the flood isn't a punishment. It's just the way things are, a world that needs to be shaped, tamed, made safe for people. Now, let's get into psychology for a minute. Why do these stories last? Why do people keep telling them even when they live far from rivers or seas? Part of it is trauma, like we talked about, but part of it is the power of story itself. A good story answers the big questions. Where did we come from? Why do bad things happen? How do we survive? Flood myths answer all three. They say you came from survivors. Bad things happen, but there's hope. You survive by listening, by preparing, by working together. And then there's the shared feeling. Flood myths are told in groups, around fires, in temples, at family gatherings. They bring people together. They create a sense of shared identity. We are the people who survived the flood. We are the children of those who rebuilt. That's powerful. It's more than just memory. It's pride and unity and hope. The geography matters too. People who live near rivers, lakes, or coasts are always at risk. Even if the last big flood was generations ago, the land keeps the memory alive. Floodplains show marks of water long gone. Sediment layers and caves or wells tell silent stories. Sometimes the only clue is a bit of pottery, far from where it should be. These traces are easy to miss, but they're everywhere. If you know how to look, here's where science and myth meet. Scientists today use stories to guide their digs. If a legend says the city drowned, they check the seafloor nearby. If an old tale talks about a river changing course, they look for ancient channels buried under fields. Sometimes the stories point to real places, sometimes they don't. But even when they don't, the search itself is valuable. It connects past and present, fact and feeling. Now, think about the idea of rebirth. That's a big theme in almost every flood myth. Destruction isn't the end. It's the start of something new. The survivors plant seeds, release birds, set up stones, or write laws. The flood clears away the old, but it also makes space for what comes next. That's a hard lesson, but an important one. Life can begin again even after disaster. And here's something beautiful. These stories change as people change. They're not frozen in time. As new dangers appear, the myth adapts. Maybe the flood becomes a plague, a war, or some other threat. Maybe the survivor is a woman instead of a man. Maybe the rescue comes from a different animal or a new god. The core remains. Something terrible happens, but survival is possible. Some people wonder if we'll ever stop telling flood myths. Maybe one day we'll move beyond them. But every time there's a real disaster, a hurricane, a tsunami, a big storm, new stories appear. Old lessons are retold in new ways. The myth is alive even now. Let's talk about what all this means for us right now. Most of us don't live in the world of our ancestors. We have weather reports, flood barriers, insurance, but the fear is still there. When the news shows pictures of cities underwater or people climbing onto roofs to escape rising water, something stirs inside us. It feels old. It feels familiar. The story is still with us, and maybe that's the point. Flood myths aren't just about water. They're about losing control, about facing the unknown, about what happens when everything safe is gone. But they're also about starting over, about hope, about the courage it takes to rebuild. They remind us that we come from survivors, that we're stronger than we think. So when you hear a flood story, whether it's from an ancient tablet, a sacred book, or your grandmother's memory, know that you're hearing something important. It's not just a story. It's a message passed down through the ages. A reminder life is unpredictable but not hopeless. The flood will end. The waters will go down. Someone will climb out wet and shaking and begin again. That's the lesson hidden in the myth. Not just fear, but hope. Not just loss, but renewal. And as long as people tell stories, that message will survive. Now, let's imagine what all this looks like from a distance. A planet shaped by water, a species shaped by memories of disaster and survival. Every culture, every family carrying its own version of the same truth. We faced the flood before and we'll face it again, but we'll keep going. That's what the flood myth really means. It's not just about the past. It's a guide for the future. A kind of promise hidden in a story that no matter what comes, we'll find a way to start over. That's what makes these stories last. That's what makes them matter. Imagine waking up one morning in a place you've always called home. Somewhere your family has lived for as long as anyone can remember. Maybe it's a small village near a river or a cluster of houses close to the coast. The land is familiar. You know every path, every stone, every twist in the water. Your parents and grandparents told you stories about the river's moods. Sometimes it's gentle. Sometimes it rises and floods the fields, but it always goes back down. It always leaves something behind. But now, something feels different. The rain has been falling for days, not just a normal downpour. This is endless. The sky is heavy gray, pressing down. The river is already out of its banks. People are nervous. Old people mutter that they've seen this before, but not like this. You stand with your neighbors, staring at the water. It keeps rising faster than it ever has. Trees disappear, roads vanish, the fields are gone. The current is strong, pulling at everything in its path. You hear shouting, people are gathering what they can carry. Food, tools, blankets. Some are piling into boats, others are climbing to higher ground. The water reaches your doorstep. It's cold, muddy, full of things floating by. Branches, baskets, even whole roofs. You grab whatever you can. There's no time to think. Just move. People are crying, calling out names, looking for their families. Animals are loose, running in panic. The world you knew is slipping away, covered by water that won't stop. This isn't just a scary story. This is something that has happened in one form or another to people all over the world. It's the kind of disaster that no one forgets. It shakes everything, your sense of safety, your trust in the land, your hope for tomorrow. Surviving something like this is more than luck. It's about being ready. It's about listening to warnings, even if they sound impossible. It's about knowing when to run and when to hold on. The human experience of a flood is more than just running from water. It's the panic when the ground gives way beneath you, the smell of wet earth and broken plants, the sound of things crashing in the dark, the taste of fear in your mouth, the feeling that everything stable is gone. People who survive remember these details forever. They can't help it. The memory is burned in sharper than any normal day. After the water goes down, the world is strange. Mud everywhere, houses tilted or broken, livestock missing, fields ruined. Sometimes nothing is left but pieces. You pick through the wreckage looking for anything you can save. Sometimes you find something precious, a tool, a keepsake, a scrap of cloth. Sometimes you find nothing at all. People gather together, silent, numb, not sure what happens next. But here's what's strange and kind of amazing. People start to rebuild. They clear the mud. They share what little food is left. They tell each other what happened over and over, trying to make sense of it. The first night after the flood, maybe everyone sleeps in one dry house, or in a cave, or under a tree on high ground. Someone lights a fire. People sit together, not talking much at first, just listening to the crackle, feeling the warmth, trying to believe they're safe again. Then someone starts to speak. Maybe it's just a simple question. Did you see the water take the old bridge? Maybe it's a memory. I remember when my father said the river could rise this high. Little by little, the story grows. People add details. What they saw, what they lost, what saved them. Children listen with wide eyes. Even the grown-ups are quiet, letting the story settle into their bones. This is how a flood becomes more than just an event. It turns into a story, not just a warning but a record, something to pass down. So the next time the river rises, people remember. The story changes with each telling, but the heart of it stays the same. Water came. Very thing changed. We survived. Now zoom out. Imagine this scene playing out not just in one village, but in hundreds, thousands, different languages, different customs, but the same fear, the same shock, the same need to explain what happened. This is how a shared memory is born. Not from books, but from stories told around fires, from scars on the land, from the things people carry with them, both the objects they save and the lessons they learn. Let's look at a few real examples of how flood shaped human lives in ways that go beyond the obvious. Not just what was destroyed, but how people changed, how they adapted, how the flood left its mark. Start with Mesopotamia, the land between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. This is where some of the earliest cities grew up, places like Eridu and Lagash. People built their houses out of mud brick. They dug canals to bring water to their fields. The rivers were a blessing, but also a threat. In years when the snow melted fast in the mountains, the rivers rose higher than anyone expected. Whole towns disappeared under brown water. Sometimes the floods were gentle, leaving behind rich soil. But every so often, the rivers went wild. Dikes broke. Water swept away everything in its path. Archaeologists have dug up layers of mud in these ancient cities. Sometimes, in the middle of where a house should be, there's just silt, no bricks, no pottery, nothing. Other times, they find a clean layer of clay with new buildings on top. It's as if people left then came back and started over. They didn't give up. They rebuilt, sometimes stronger than before. They built higher walls, better drainage, new temples to ask the gods for mercy. The flood changed not just the land, but the way people lived. It forced them to work together, to plan, to think about the future. The Nile is another good example. Every year it flooded. People counted on it. They measured the water, watched for the first rise. There were special stones, niometers, that showed how high the water was getting. Too low, and there was famine. Too high, and villages drowned. The Egyptians learned to live with this rhythm. They built their calendar around it. They invented ways to store water, to move it where it was needed. And when the flood came too strong or too early, it was a disaster, but also a lesson. People remember the bad years. They told stories about angry gods, about the river's power, about the need to stay humble, move east to China. The Yellow River is famous for its floods. It's not just a river, It's a force of nature. It carries more silt than any other river on earth. Sometimes the riverbed rises so high that it sits above the land around it, held in place only by levees. When those levees break, the water spreads for miles, turning fields into lakes. In 1931, the Yellow River flooded so badly that millions of people had to flee. Towns vanished. The land was changed forever. This wasn't the first time. There are records of huge floods going back thousands of years. Each time people adapted. Sometimes they moved. Sometimes they rebuilt elsewhere. Sometimes they tried to tame the river with new technology. But the memory of disaster never left. Let's talk about what happens to people after a flood. When the excitement is over and the hard work begins, first, there's shock. People are tired, hungry, maybe injured. They look for lost family. They check to see what survived. Then comes the work, cleaning, rebuilding, planting new crops. Sometimes whole villages move to higher ground, leaving behind the old life. Sometimes they stay and try again. The flood forces people to make choices. It tests what matters most. Family, food, faith. It changes the way people see the world. But floods don't just destroy. Sometimes they bring new lel. If the mud left behind can make fields richer, fish might be trapped in pools easy to catch. New plants spring up. People learn to see both the danger and the gift. They learn to plan for both. There's something else, too. After a big flood, people often create rituals or ceremonies. They might hold a feast to thank the river for sparing them, or a day of silence to remember those lost. Some build shrines on high ground so the gods will see them next time. Others plant trees or carve marks on rocks to show how high the water came. These aren't just religious acts. They're ways of remembering, of making sure the lesson isn't forgotten. Here's another angle. Floods can change who's in charge. After a disaster, old leaders might be blamed for not protecting the village. New leaders might rise up, promising to keep everyone safe. Sometimes the survivors are the ones who listened to warnings, who acted quickly, who helped others. They become respected, maybe even legendary. In some cultures, the founder of a new dynasty is someone who survived a great flood. The disaster becomes part of their claim to power. I lived through the worst. I know how to keep you safe. The flood doesn't just reshape the land, it reshapes society. Floods can also change how people think about time. Before the flood, life might have seemed predictable. The seasons came and went, crops grew. Children were born. After the flood, time feels split in two before and after. People count years from the great disaster. They mark anniversaries. They tell their children, this is how the world was before the water came. The flood becomes a marker, something that divides history. Let's talk about memory. Not just what actually happened, but how people remember it. Scientists call this collective memory. The way a group remembers something, even if most of them weren't there. Floods create these memories because they're dramatic, emotional, life-changing. The story gets told and retold. Details might change, but the feeling stays over time. The memory becomes a myth. Maybe the water didn't really cover the whole earth. Maybe it was just one valley. But the story grows until it feels like the end of the world. Think about how these memories shape the future. Children who grow up hearing flood stories are more likely to listen to warnings. They might build their houses higher or further from the river. They might keep boats ready or store extra food. The story is a kind of insurance, a way to keep the next disaster from being as bad. Now, let's consider the emotional side. Living through a flood isn't just about physical survival. It's about dealing with loss, the loss of a home, a loved one, a way of life. Some people come through stronger. Others carry wounds that never heal. But almost everyone who survives a big flood is changed by it. They see the world differently. Maybe they're more careful, or more grateful, or more determined. Maybe they're more afraid. The flood leaves its mark inside, not just outside. There's also a sense of unity that can come from disaster. People who go through something hard together often form strong bonds. They help each other, share what little they have, look out for the weak. The flood breaks down old barriers, rich and poor, young and old, neighbor and stranger. For a while, everyone's in the same boat, literally or not. That feeling can last long after the water is gone. But floods can also bring division. When resources are scarce, people might fight over what's left. Old arguments can flare up. Sometimes new groups are formed, survivors who feel different from everyone else. The flood creates both unity and separation depending on how people respond. Look at how these patterns play out in history. In the Netherlands, where much of the Ella and is below sea level, people learned to work together to build dikes and pumps. They created a system where everyone had to help or everyone would drown. The flood force cooperation in Bangladesh, where rivers flood every year, people learn to build houses on stilts, to grow crops that survive underwater, to move quickly when the warning comes. The flood shaped not just the land, but the culture. Even today, with all our technology, floods still change lives. When Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans in 2005, the city was underwater for weeks. Thousands lost their homes. Whole neighborhoods vanished. The people who lived through it still talk about what they saw, what they lost, how they survived. The memory is fresh, even for those who were just children at the time. In 2011, a massive tsunami hit Japan. Waves up to 130 feet high crashed over the coast. Towns were destroyed in minutes. The survivors rebuilt. But the memory of that day shapes everything they do now, where they live, how they prepare, what stories they tell their children. Here's the thing that keeps me curious. No matter when or where floods happen, people respond in similar ways. They remember, they rebuild, they tell stories. The details change, but the pattern is there. Loss, survival, hope. Over time, the story becomes bigger than the event. It turns into a lesson, a warning, a promise. So, what does all this mean for us? Maybe it's a reminder that we're not as separate from the past as we think. The fears, the hopes, the ways people cope with disaster. They haven't changed much. The details are different, but the emotions are the same. When we hear ancient flood stories, we're hearing echoes of real lives, real losses, real courage. Maybe it's also a lesson about humility. The world is bigger than any one person or any one generation. Water can shape the land, erase cities, start the world over. But people adapt. They find ways to survive. They remember and they pass those memories on. And maybe most important, it's a lesson about hope. The flood doesn't last forever. The water goes down, people come out of hiding, blinking in the sun, and start again. The world is never quite the same, but life goes on. That's what the old stories say. That's what the land remembers. That's what survivors know. In the end, the human experience of flood is about more than disaster. It's about memory, about coming together, about starting over. It's about turning fear into story and story into strength. That's why these tales have lasted so long. That's why they matter even now. And that's why, as long as there are people to listen, the memory of the flood and what comes after will survive. So after all this talk about floods, let's step back and look at the big picture. Why do these stories matter? Why do they show up everywhere, lasting longer than most memories? It's more than just water rising and people running. There's something deeper in the way these stories stick around. They aren't just warnings. They aren't just legends. They are a window into how humans think, feel, and survive through change. Start with the basics. People everywhere have watched water shape the world. They've seen rivers change course, lakes disappear, and seas creep up over land. Sometimes it happens slow. Other times, everything shifts in a single night. If you've ever seen a flood, even a small one, you know how fast things can go from normal to chaos. The ground turns to mud. The places you trust turn dangerous. What used to be safe is suddenly gone. But the real lesson isn't just about water. It's about how humans react when their whole world changes. Some disasters come and go, leaving little behind. Floods leave scars you can see. They also leave stories, and those stories work their way into the bones of a culture. They turn into something bigger than just a memory of disaster. Why does that happen? There are a few reasons. First, floods wipe the slate clean. They don't just damage a village or a field. Sometimes they erase everything. When that happens, people are forced to start over. That's a powerful experience. It's not something you forget. When you rebuild from nothing, every choice feels important. You remember the mistakes. You remember what saved you. Often that gets turned into a story handed down to anyone who will listen. Second, floods blur the line between normal life and something bigger. Water has always been mysterious. It can be calm or wild, gentle or deadly. In a flood, it stops obeying the rules. It acts like a force with its own will that makes people wonder why it happened. Was it a punishment? A message? Just bad luck? When you can't answer those questions, you start telling stories to make sense of what happened. That's how myths are born. There's another layer too. Floods connect people to each other, not just the ones who live through the same disaster, but everyone who hears the story later. When you listen to a flood tale, you feel what the survivors felt. The fear, the hope, the relief when the water goes down. That's why these stories last. They make you feel like you're part of something bigger, stretching back through time. You can see this in the way people talk about floods long after they happen. Even generations later, the story isn't just about the disaster, it's about survival, about what was lost and what was saved, about the moment when everything seemed finished, but life found a way to start again. These stories shape how people see themselves. They're not just victims, they're survivors, they're builders, they're the ones who remember. Think about how this works in real life. After a big flood, people come together in as they never did before. Old arguments don't matter as much. Everyone's focused on the same goal, getting through the crisis, helping each other, finding a way forward. That sense of unity doesn't always last, but while it's there, it's powerful. People remember who helped, who shared food, who risked their lives for someone else. Those memories become part of the story too. But it's not all about unity. Sometimes floods lead to change that isn't so simple. Old leaders get blamed if people think they didn't do enough. New leaders appear, promising to keep everyone safe next time. Sometimes the whole way a community is run shifts after a disaster. People might move away or stay and build something new. The flood becomes a turning point, the start of a new chapter. It's not just about the people either. Floods change the land itself. Rivers might cut new channels. Fields turn into lakes. Forests become swamps. Places that were important before are gone, replaced by something new. That's why so many old myths talk about lost cities under the waves or lands that vanished in a single night. They're trying to explain changes that really happened but are hard to understand. This is where things get really interesting. Even in places where the flood happened thousands of years ago, people still talk about it. Sometimes they don't even realize the story is about a real event. It just becomes part of the background, like a dream everyone remembers, but can't quite explain. That's how you end up with over 200 cultures telling the same kind of story, even though they never met. And here's the twist. Sometimes the story outlies the facts. Maybe the details get mixed up. Maybe the flood was just local, not world. Maybe the boat was a raft or a cave or just a place on high ground. Over time, the odd story gets bigger, more dramatic, but underneath it, it's still about the same thing. The world changed. People survived. They remembered. Some people ask, why floods? Why not earthquakes, or fires, or other disasters? Part of it is that floods are easy to imagine. You can see water coming. You can feel it rising. It's a slow kind of fear, building up until there's nothing you can do but run. That makes a strong image, one that sticks in your mind and comes back in dreams. But there's another reason. Water is life, but it's also the unknown. It hides things. It can bring new life or take it away. When a flood happens, it feels like the world is starting over. Clean slate, new chance. That's a powerful idea, and it shows up in stories everywhere. Sometimes the survivors are chosen by the gods. Sometimes they're just lucky or smart or quick to act. Either way, the story says you can get through this. You can start again. That's one of the big lessons from all these myths. If you look close, disaster isn't the end. It's just a new beginning. Even when everything is lost, people find a way to rebuild. They make new homes. They plant new crops. They tell new stories or keep the old ones alive. The world goes on, even if it looks different than before. Let's look at the other side. Not everyone survives a flood. Some losses are permanent. Some scars never heal. That's part of the story, too. Myths don't hide that pain. They warn about it. They remind people to respect the power of nature, to prepare when they can, to listen to those who know the signs. In that way, flood stories are a kind of guidebook. They teach you what to watch for, what to do when things go wrong, how to face the worst, and still hope for the best. You can see the same pattern in history again and again. Big disasters come, people are shaken, some fall apart, others come together and build something better. Over time, the story of what happened becomes more than just a warning. It's a source of pride, proof that people made it through, that they didn't give up even when it seemed like the whole world was against them. And that's why these stories matter. Even now, we live in a world that still changes. Floods still happen. People still lose everything and start over. The details are different. Maybe it's a hurricane or a tsunami or heavy rains that last for weeks, but the feelings are the same. The shock, the fear, the hope that things will get better, the memory of what was lost, and the dream of what could come next. Flood stories remind us that we're part of a long chain. We're not the first to face disaster, and we won't be the last. Our ancestors lived through their own floods, both real and imagined. They passed down what they learned, hoping we'd listen. Sometimes we do. Sometimes we forget and have to learn again. But the stories are still there, waiting to be told. So next time you hear a flood myth, don't just think of it as an old tale. See it as a message from people who faced the unknown and survived. A reminder that change is part of life, that fear doesn't last forever, that hope can rise even when the world seems washed away. And maybe most of all, remember that stories are how we make sense of chaos, how we find meaning in disaster, how we hold on to each other, even when everything else is gone. That's why flood myths endure. They're more than just warnings. They're proof that no matter what happens, people have always found a way to begin again. As you drift towards sleep, let that settle in. The world is always changing. Sometimes the safest ground turns uncertain, but people adapt, they remember, they tell stories that light the way forward. Floods come and go. Stories last, and in those stories, hope floats.